we have a session of 1 hour 35 minutes. We have 4 presenters, all of them are online, and we have 3 presentations. So what we will do, we will have 20 to 25 minutes for each presentation, and after that we will have a final discussion. So welcome to our panel called Coexisting Ethnicities and Coexisting Materiality on the Northern Asian Borderlands. So I will first introduce our topic and the different aspects it will deal with. So all of us are anthropologists and we work among minority people living in China, Russia, and Mongolia. Most of these minority groups are stateless people who have kin on the other side of the border. So furthermore, these 3 states share common borders that were closed for decades. As you know, since the 1990s, the Sino-Russian and the Sino-Mongolian borders have reopened and have driven an important increase of populations cross-border movements for diverse purposes, such as commercial trade, tourism, and ethnic festivals. So the aim of our panel is thus to investigate through different perspectives how the borders, as a permeable and flexible entity, are experienced by local people who coexist along them. So we choose to approach coexistence through ethnicity and materiality. In other words, we try to understand how contacts between border people shape ethnicity and produce material culture in North Asia. Okay, so we will start with Aurore Dumont's presentation. So Aurore is an anthropologist. Her current research focuses on ritual practices among the Tungus and Mongol societies in northern China, from the late Qing up to the present. She is currently a Marie Curie Fellow at the French National Center for Scientific Research and with the research group Societies, Religions, and Laicities in France. So she will be talking about changing perceptions of ethnicity on the Sino-Mongolian and Sino-Russian borderlands. Thank you, Anne. So my presentation is dedicated to the way ethnicity is perceived and experienced by cross-border people who live along the Sino-Russian and the Sino-Mongolian borders. First of all, I shall say a few words about what I mean by ethnicity. The term ethnicity is, of course, almost never used by local people themselves, who would rather use descriptions, impressions, and feelings to highlight a sense of belonging to a community, or, on the contrary, a sense of estrangement. Thus, I wish to emphasize the unique perception of ethnicity, that is to say, what people feel and say about their kin others, and what is happening in terms of sociability and connectivity when they meet. In order to do so, I give special focus to likeness and otherness, 2 notions that are recurrent in cross-border people's everyday discourses. So the questions I raise are, how do cross-border people perceive each other when they meet, when they really meet? And the second question is, can we say that borders may create, transform, or shape ethnicity? My main field research is situated in the municipality of Colombo in the People's Republic of China. You can see it on the map in red. It is a very vast area situated between Russia and Mongolia in the northeastern corner of the Inner Mongolia Autonomous Region. So in Colombo in the northeast, next to the Russian border, one finds a geographical continuation of the Siberian taiga, while the southwest accommodates the Mongolian grasslands. So these 2 different ecological environments are home to various Tungus and Mongol minority groups, officially labeled as ethnic minorities. Today, I will talk about the Evenki, Landerherders, the Tungus people who live along the Sino-Russian border, and the Horchi, a Mongol people who live along the Sino-Mongolian border. So we are in a big space, but divided into two ecological environments where different kinds of people live. In Colombia, I conducted fieldwork in the so-called Auluya ethnic village, which is the village of the Evenki Wanderherders, but also in border townships. I also conducted two short fieldworks in Mongolia, one in the city of Changpaisan, which is situated in eastern Mongolia, next to China, and another one in the capital city, Ulaanbaatar. Regarding my research methodology, I practice participant observation, sharing the daily life of my informants coming from different ethnic groups. I have to say that my research was initially devoted to nomadism and ritual practices. Was devoted and is still devoted. And during my research on these topics, it appeared that borders, whether they have been crossed or not by local people, were constitutive of people's imaginary and perception of ethnicity. This is how I started integrating the topic of border in my research. On the field, I did not prioritize any social entity to the detriment of another, thereby allowing me to obtain different stances and opinions from my informants. I held formal and informal discussions with different actors from various backgrounds, pastoralist people, businessmen, employees of the local authorities, and so on. This allowed me to gather various unique points of view on the transborder paradigm. So the first case study involves the Evenki Wanderherders who live on both sides of the Sino-Russian border. So the Evenki originally formed one single people living in southeast Siberia, Russia. Their mode of subsistence relied primarily on an equal combination of herding, reindeer herding, and hunting. At the end of the 19th century, in order to avoid Russian taxes and to find better hunting grounds, some Evenki people crossed the border with their reindeer and settled in Colombia, in China. Also, these Evenki were now living within the two borders. They maintained contact with the Evenki who stayed in Russia and kept crossing the porous borders regularly. An important point worth noting is that nomadic people have and still have their own perception of the territory conceived as hunting grounds and pasture lands and not as a demarcated geopolitical border. In the 1960s, the Sino-Soviet split conflict led to a violent border shutdown. And for the Evenki, contacts with kin living over the border became impossible and even dangerous. It became a crime. For decades, the Evenki of Russia and China lived as two distant peoples belonging to two different states. After the fall of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, a new era of contacts and interactions emerged along the new European border. Cross-border movements of Evenki people between China and Russia increased, but involved mainly official cultural delegation, represented by members of the Evenki intelligentsia, while ordinary people were left out. What I mean by ordinary people is people who are not part of this, delegation, who work in the local administration and so on. So at this time, so almost 20 years ago, I was working with my colleague Alexandra Lervillier, who is also an anthropologist and who works on the Evenki of Russia. So we were working on a project which consists of showing to our Evenki informants ethnographic data from the other field. This means that I showed to my Evenki informants in China Alexandra's pictures and material of Evenki in Russia, and vice versa. We have noticed a mutual interest from both sides and decided to go further in our project by organizing a meeting between Chinese and Russian reindeer herders. So in 2014, Alexandra Lervillier and I integrated a Russian community reindeer herders and Gorbachev in the research team for collectively performing field research among the Chinese Evenki during 1 month in China. And on the field, we were equal importance to practicing and discourses. So we arrived in China together with our colleague from Russia. And what happens then when reindeer herders sharing the same ethnicity but not the same country meet for the first time through an organized meeting? Our ethnographic observations reveal that the first feeling that emerges is an immediate understanding of each other, and more importantly, a sense of belonging to the same group. People would frequently say, "We are exactly the same," or "These Evenki are exactly like us." So the notion of likeness, which is recurrent in everyday discourse, encompassing different realities and meanings. First of all, being like the other means to speak the same language and thus to be able to understand each other. So of course, in China, the reindeer herders speak Chinese. Some of them have Chinese as a native language, and in Russia, the Evenki speak Russian. But when they met, they had to use Evenki to understand each other. But the language is not only a medium of communication, it also allows the specific Evenki terminology used to describe the biodiversity, the landscapes, and the nomadic practices that are the core of Evenki's way of life and thus identity. Secondly, the Chinese and Russian Evenki consider each other as the same people because of their specific domestic economy based on reindeer herding and hunting. After having shared and compared their techniques, our informants explained to us that although they are living in 2 separate states for years, the way they herd reindeer and the way they hunt remain exactly the same. In other words, both groups share identical skills, techniques, and values that again form the core of what Evenki people consider to be their identity. Third, both Chinese and Russian Evenki possess the same system of beliefs. Indeed, on both sides of the border, the Evenki perceive their natural environment as a coherent whole made up of natural and supernatural entities, and they would honor these deities in the same manner, that is to say, by feeding them with food and alcohol in order to obtain their protection. In the case of the Chinese and Russian Evenki, the border has effectively acted as a separator for decades. People were split apart, and Chinese and Russian governments created diverse ways of managing their territory and inhabitants. Despite these differences, the geopolitical border did not create a real discontinuation in means of living and material culture. As the event key explained, the natural environment on both sides of the border remain the same, and the way of using and appropriating it also remains the same. Now let us look at a very different case today. It concerns the Mongols from China and the Mongols from Mongolia. So as you know, the main difference between the two countries is that in China, Mongols are an ethnic minority, while in Mongolia they are a state nationality. Also, in China, Mongols are almost 6 million of people, while in Mongolia they are less than 3 million, which means that there are more Mongols in China than in Mongolia. On both sides of the border, the Mongols are part of different groups who do not necessarily speak the same dialects. So here I will talk about the Kharchi of Ulumburi in China and the Han of Mongolia. So the Kharchi arrived in Ulumburi around the 1960s. So these people are not native of Ulumburi. They were coming from other parts of Inner Mongolia. So like the Sino-Russian border, the long border between Mongolia and Russia and China, reopened in the 1990s and allowed trade, investment, tourism, cultural exchanging, and other activities. People also overcame the separation forced on them by the border by going to China and Mongolia. Numerous Mongols of Ulumburi visited Mongolia, while others have been engaged in media business. Many Mongols from Inner Mongolia have also sought career opportunities in the emerging and expanding border areas since the 1990s. This is the case of the Kharchi, who take an active part in private business, especially mining, but not only mining, between Mongolia and China. So their ability to speak both Mandarin Chinese and Mongolian languages has allowed them to become bridges in the economic relationship between Mongolia and China. But how do Mongols from China and Mongols from Mongolia perceive each other? Some Mongols people from China told me that after the reopening of the border in the 90s, they were very excited about the idea to meet the Mongols from the other side of the border because they were perceived as kin in the face of Han Chinese, who constitute the most numerous population in Inner Mongolia. But several unfortunate experiences along the Sino-Mongolian border have somehow deteriorated the cross-border sociality and have changed people's idea about Mongolian ethnicity and what it means to be a real Mongol. Many Kharchi going in Mongolia either for a trip or for business were offended to be constantly called Chinese by Han Mongols. Mongols from Mongolia explain this otherness by the fact that the only real Mongols are themselves because they speak the right dialect and are not surrounded by autochthonous people, as it is the case in China. Kharchi are perceived as Chinese because they supposedly behave like Han Chinese. They eat a lot of vegetables, speak with a Chinese accent, are good at business, and are dressed in a Chinese way. The Kharchi on their side continue to claim that they are indeed Chinese in terms of citizenship, but Mongolian in terms of ethnicity. As Kharchi people explained to me, Inner Mongols are even sometimes more Mongol than the Mongols over the border. A proof of that is the fact that the Mongolian traditional script is still used in China, whereas it has been replaced by Cyrillic in Mongolia. Also, inner Mongols and Mongols share a cultural and linguistic heritage. Borders have contributed to the emergence of fluctuating vision of Chinese men and Mongolians along the Sino-Mongolian border. Through these two different case studies, we see that transborder people may have several manners of perceiving their kin across the border. There is no one manner. There are multiple manners. While some transborder people feel that they are the same, others consider to be only familiar strangers. I believe it is not the border itself that creates and shapes ethnicity, but the ways people experience it. They experience the border through imagination, feelings, and actions that shape, step by step, their changing perception of ethnicity. Thank you. That was my presentation. So now our second presenter is Anne Dallas-Maréchal. She is a doctor in religious anthropology. Her research focuses on religious interactions in the Amur region, and more specifically on the impact of Christian movements on local populations since the 1850s. She teaches at the University of Saint-Étienne in France and is an associate member at the group Société Religion Laïcité, also in France. So the title of her paper is Recreation of Visible Ethnic Identities Among the Fenghe in China and the Nanai in Russia, a comparative study of cultural heritage processes.
Thank you. I will share my screen. Okay, hello everyone. Thank you, Aurore. So on either side of the Amur River, a same ethnic group with two denominations can be found, the Nanai and the Fenghe, who used to form one kin group. In the 1850s, this ethnic group was divided when the Amur River became the frontier between China and Russia. Both groups are now what each country sees as an official minority group, and they do not speak the same language anymore. The Nanai mostly speak Russian and the Fenghe Chinese, and as opposed to what Aurore just presented, they cannot speak a common language when they meet. Okay. So the Nanai people in Russia constitute a group of about 12,000 individuals. Most of the Nanai population lives in villages in the Nanai district. The Fenghe people in China are about 5,000 individuals scattered along the Sungari and the Amur rivers in the Heilongjiang province in 4 ethnic villages. On both sides, the main economic resource is fishing. The data I'm presenting today comes from fieldwork I conducted in the Amur region between 2011 and 2015, and you may see on the maps the places I visited. And the fieldwork in China was conducted with Aurore, who is with us today. So in China, as in Russia, cultural policies aim at underlining the specificities of the minority groups while integrating them as much as possible within a so-called political unity. In Northeast China, the safeguarding of Fenghe crafts, promoted both by the UNESCO and by the Chinese administration since the 2010s, resulted in the creation of new type of items. Some of these are made from fish skins and are very different to what can be found amongst the Fenghe kin group in Russia, the Nanai. Among the latter, the display of indigenous cultures tends to go mostly alongside museum activities. With these policies, minority groups are being staged somehow, and they are encouraged to express a form of collective ethnic identity. Ethnic identities, as perceived and promoted by the government, are defined by classification through official policies and politics. But ethnicity is also a category responding to the need to define a group in relation to others, quote unquote, based on a territory, a language, or a culture that is considered as common to one group. So in this presentation, I will use the term ethnic or ethnicity as a term relying on a double theoretical premise. It is simultaneously self-defined in relation to others and also the result of political classification. And for me, this term is also inevitably linked to the notion of tradition as advanced in heritage-making policies. Broadly speaking, I will define tradition as a categorization of practices considered as authentic, quote-unquote, within the complete range of actions available to one group. And the aim of my presentation is precisely to discuss how authenticity is created. Then about kosher fish skin artifacts, and I will finish with the case of the Yumacan epic storytelling and the involvement of the UNESCO. So in Russia, since the beginning of the Soviet regime, cultural policies put forward indigenous cultures in different ways, in museums, in dance shows, exhibitions, festivals, etc. Heritage-making processes among minority groups compel them to distinguish themselves from other minority groups too, and from the dominant population. And for the Nanai, it is mainly done through museums, and the highlight on material culture offers a sort of stage on which some Nanai may express what they perceive as their own indigenous art. The acknowledgement of embroiderers as artists is something very recent, which went alongside the development of museum activity during the Soviet period. Today, the most talented, quote-unquote, embroiderers become masteritsi, the members of the Professional Union of Artists in Russia. So, talent, quote-unquote, here, as I will show, responds to a threefold legitimation process, which depends on the recognition by the Nanai of the exogenous origins of the embroiderer's skills, on the recognition of a familial inheritance, and on the recognition of an institutional sanction. So since the 1930s, censuses have been conducted to record the names of embroiderers, either by official instances such as museums or the Artists' Union, for instance, or by Nanai people involved in the study of Nanai culture. Naming the artist and professionalizing the practice has led to an individualization of embroidering. So today, in addition to providing objects for museums, for example, these masteritsi are now telling their own personal life stories, often built in the same pattern, and in which one can recognize the shamanic background. So these women were born in families constituted of many children, many of whom died when they were very young. They were often very sick in their childhood and had to be cured by shamans. The content and structure of these life stories may be compared to the election discourses of the shamans, in which they relate how they came to become shamans. The compulsive need to practice something is actually at the center of the narratives. So the shamans feel spiritually coerced to dance or to sing, for instance, and embroiderers to embroider. So the masteritsi actually feel the need to embroider for hours at a time, often at the expense of their well-being. For instance, in 2014, Yulia had a degenerative disease of the eyes, which was gradually making her blind. Nadezhda had a cardiac disease. Zinaida's eyes were hurting her a lot and preventing her from embroidering too long. In 2015, Claudia said she couldn't bear sitting down for long hours at a time, which is obviously something you have to do when you're embroidering. So the compulsion to embroider made them hurt both physically and mentally, as they felt spiritually compelled to embroider, and yet could not comply physically with the need to do it. In these stories, the embroiderers also see the motifs of their embroideries in dreams. Among the Nanai, the dreams are considered as a spiritual space common to one clan, where humans, spirits, and members of the same clan may interfere. And dreams often serve as explanations for understanding the influence of the shamanic spirits on people. For instance, if someone sees a dead person in their dreams, it means that this deceased person is haunting their relatives. So the source of the embroiderer's talent, as resulting from both a compulsion and dreamlike visions, endows the practice with spiritual and or shamanic characteristics. And this is somehow undeniable in the story of another Nanai embroiderer who lives in Khobarovsk, who is named Raisa. In her story, dreams play a leading role. For instance, when she was visiting her in-laws in one of the Nanai villages, she dreamt of a dead woman haunting the village. Or another example is, a few years ago, her son had a major car accident and he remained stuck in the car for a whole night. And she told me that she dreamt of that car crash that night and woke up singing and like a shaman before she was even told that her son had an accident. And she also says, of course, that her embroiderers come to her in dreams. And Raisa wrote a self-published book about her life as an embroiderer, a book that is sold in museums and in tourist shops, for example. It is written as a sort of personal journal, and it is filled with short stories about Raisa's life, often centered on spiritual practices and illustrated with her embroideries. So the use of the mythical and shamanic registry within these life stories enables the embroiderers to call upon a spiritual heritage, and the readers, be they Nanai or not, will recognize the exogenous origin of their skills, which provides a first form of legitimation. So integrating these elements to the museumification of these objects, of their objects, enables the embroiderers to give sense to the museum processes within the Nanai thought system. The Masteritsi have usually learned how to embroider from, thanks to a family heritage. It usually consists of techniques. A woman may inherit the stock of motifs used by an embroiderer in her family, for example. She may inherit her tools and sometimes her dresses. And all the embroiderers I've met display this inheritance, either by showing the specific skills they have acquired, like the ability to saw a very fine stitch, or the objects they had inherited, like tools or dresses, the older the better. And this second form of legitimation calls upon Nanai traditional means of transmission through inheritance from blood or clan relatives, which enables the embroiderers to root museumification processes within the Nanai kinship structures. And finally, museums and cultural policies encourage embroiderers to compete against each other in festivals, shows, and exhibitions. This competitive display sanctions the best embroiderers with diplomas and prizes. These are usually displayed on the walls or the shelves in the embroiderer's house. So Zinaida, for instance, who claims strong spiritual abilities in her life story, she says that she would have been a shaman in ancient times, for instance. She also displays her prizes on the shelves of her house and tags her creations ready for display, as you may see on the pictures here. Thus, since the Soviet years, a third, more recent form of legitimation appears in the form of institutional sanctions. It goes alongside the individualization of the practice, as the winners, quote unquote, are recognized by name and become professional artists. So heritage making in museums thereby register Nanai embroidering outside of the Nanai group, within the Russian legitimation processes. So within the context of heritageization, Nanai embroiderers have elaborated new legitimation processes. Their personal life stories place them within the ancient patterns of transmission, but their practice calls upon constant innovation. So on the Russian side of the border, it could be said that tradition appears as a dynamic and innovative process, heavily linked to transmission, as the Latin root of the word, traditio, suggests, meaning the act of transmitting. In Northeast China, since the 2010s, two visible cultural elements are today being put forward among the Chinese Nanai kin group, the Hezhe, the fish skin embroideries, and the Yimakan storytelling, which is a specific kind of epic story. Both constitute a tourist attraction around which structures and commerce are developing. Both are part of political safeguarding processes of a so-called ethnic culture. The fish skins on a national level, and the Yimakan storytelling on an international level with the involvement of the UNESCO. So the comparison of embroideries and storytelling will highlight here the policies surrounding the valorization of two different cultural elements within the same political framework. Since 2006, China has been celebrating the Cultural Heritage Day in June, and the work of skins in general, and more specifically of fish skins for the Hezhe, were registered on the Chinese Intangible Cultural Heritage List. Several authors have analyzed ethnic tourism through Foucault's panopticon perspective, based on the analysis of observation and visibility in contexts of domination. So in this postulate, the touri, the person who is the object of tourism, is aware of being observed and commodized, that is, that their ethnic identity traits are viewed and used as commodities. And the whole relationship depends on both participants' belief, the tourists and the touris, in there being a linguistic, racial, cultural, or historical difference between them. And these authors stress the power imbalance of the tourist over the touri, so over the people being the object of tourism. But I argue that the relationship actually relies on co-constructions in order to be maintained. On the tourist side, participants need to find means to define themselves as other. And on the tourist side, they must find means to receive pleasurable experience through distance, to quote Xi. This co-construction, meeting each participant's ends, is quite visible amongst the Hezhe, with the creation of mural decorations made from fish skins. The artifacts created within the framework of quote-unquote conservation are actually made with new techniques and result in a new medium to fit both the need to define the tourism as Hezhe and the desired appropriation magnitude of the tourists. So in every ethnic village, so-called Hezhe shops can be found, held by Hezhe or sometimes by Han Chinese people. They sell many different objects made from fish skins, mainly good luck mural decorations of Chinese style. They are mostly done by women, but some of these artifacts are mass-produced in factories, such as keychains, for example, made of fish skin. They can represent a fish or the Chinese character for fish, which is commonly used all over China as lucky charm. They are usually also made with red knots, considered to bring luck. They also sell mural decorations, and you can see it on the picture on the right, representing various things, ranging from horses, for example, to scenes of everyday life. And you have some examples of these artifacts here. These mural decorations are made with the same techniques and representations from one village to another. In 2005, a one-year program was offered by the local government to women who wished to learn how to create fish skin artifacts in a Khoja ethnic village. Many of the owners of the Khoja shop have actually learned how to do mural decorations there. And in addition, many of these women claim that mural decorations made of fish skins were invented in the 1990s by 3 Khoja men. The fact that these objects are not considered as ancient, or that the techniques have been learned quite recently, does not, however, constitute a disadvantage for selling them. Using fish skins alone seems to justify in itself the perception of tradition surrounding these objects. And actually, on the contrary to the Nanai, the Khoja tend to work the skins differently in order to maintain the scales and the opacity of the fish skins, which is actually what is sought to be erased among the Nanai. And I think you can see the scales quite well on the second picture, the picture in the middle. And the aim of this different technique is to maintain the fish aspect of the skins, highlighting the link between the practice and the material. So although these new items are of fairly recent origin, and their usage takes place exclusively within the touristic framework, this practice demonstrates the local appropriation of the context of ethnic tourism, which combines financial gain and an expression of ethnic identity. And it shows how heritage can be driven by and among minority groups themselves to facilitate and improve life within their own communities. And actually, resorting to fish skins enables some Khoja to earn a living in multiple ways. For instance, a craftswoman in Tongjiang claimed to be earning 10,000 yuan a month with her Khoja crafts shop. Therefore, although Foucault or Yuri tend to stress the power imbalance which exists between the gazer, the tourist, and the gezi, the tourist, I argue that the case of the Khoja and their usage of fish skin is different. The Khoja's appropriation of this specific context helps adjust the power struggle to some extent within cultural policies. And the counter-example of the Yimacan storytelling will now illustrate the failure of such processes. Since 2011, the Yimacan storytelling is part of the UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage in need of urgent safeguarding. The Khoja people therefore receive material help to lead projects surrounding the inscription of this practice on the UNESCO ICH list. And I will just point out here that the data dates back from 2015, so there might have been changes on this subject since then. So the Yimacan are oral tales recounting the adventures of the hero Mergen. They also talk about shamanistic spirits, intertribal wars, etc. They are composed in verse and are sung and told in the Khoja language. Each ethnic village has its own transmitter or storyteller who can tell the Yimacan. According to the documents given to UNESCO, these tales are centuries old. And these stories can actually be found in Russian ethnography since the 1850s. Mergen is a hero throughout the Amur region, as far as Mongolia. And the term Yimacan is a Chinese transcription of the Khoja term, which can also be found among the Nanai and neighboring groups in the region under different terminology. So the Yimacan storytelling has been added to the UNESCO ICH list on the premise that it was perceived as an old practice in a dying language on the brink of extinction. The perception of an old practice by the Chinese administration actually fits the ethnographic inquiry. This particular type of storytelling can be traced back in the ethnography concerning both the Khoja and the Nanai as far back as the 1850s all over the Amur region. However, of the Yimacan storytelling on the UNESCO ICH list seemed to have a contrary effect to what to be expected when we were in the region in 2015. First, many of our Persia informants agreed on the fact that the term Yimacan itself was invented in the 1950s by ethnographers who came to the region. They also agreed that these tales were based on extracts collected by ethnographers in the 1990s. So for them, the valorization actually concerned recreated tales from exogenous origins. In addition, still according to many Khojeux, as a result of the media coverage, the storytellers were being kept hidden as a protection against media intrusion. There were very few Khojeux students who were interested in learning the Yimacan, and some students were actually paid to take the courses for studying the Yimacan. These classes were given by teachers who could not speak the language, the Khojeux language, and had to learn the texts by heart without understanding them, or so they told us. Therefore, from an ethnic perspective, the Yimacan storytelling was perceived as a recent cultural invention that did not easily find its place within the Khojeux society. So from an ethnic perspective, the Yimacan, as opposed to the use of fish skins, did not seem to respond to the possibility of expressing some form of ethnic identity. It could maybe be explained in functionalist terms by the fact that the Yimacan makes little sense in the Khojeux lifestyle. The Khojeux do not speak Khojeux anymore and do not tell these stories. Whereas the Khojeux being essentially anglers, the fish skins have an everyday sympathy more easily understandable. So, according to me, the minority group's appropriation of cultural policies appears as a decisive criteria for the development of cultural practices within the heritage creation processes. So now I will conclude. Several authors argue that cultural policies, especially with regards to indigenous populations, tend to standardize the visibility of these groups. This standardization often implies for the Tori to be fixed in an imagined past where the locals wear items or tell stories originating from their history, and where the adaptability of these groups is erased in favor of an outdated and pessimistic vision. The underlying message beneath cultural policies and instances such as UNESCO is directly and overtly linked to safekeeping, implying that these groups and their selected practices need to be saved from extinction. However, I hope I have shown this, the impact of heritage processes on the local economy transforms the practices. And there is a sense of agency behind the minority's choice to comply or not with cultural policies. So as a conclusion, it could be argued that the appropriation of cultural policies, as it provides minority groups with a sort of stage on which they can define to some extent their visibility, enables the Malay and the Khojeux to gain agency. And embroidering appears as a strategy of empowerment through which the embroiderers give their own vision and on their own terms of what it is to be Malay or Khojeux, whether it is through legitimation processes embedded in the idea of inheritance, or whether it is linked to a specific material like the fish skins. Thank you. So we will move on to our third presentation by Baida Passé and Stefan Christ. I will stop sharing my screen. Okay. So Baigal is a social and cultural anthropologist. Currently she's working as a research and program coordinator at the International Institute for the Study of Nomadic Civilizations. Also, she is a PhD candidate in anthropology at the National University of Mongolia. She obtained her MA and BA from the Minju University in China in Mongolian language and literature. Her research interests embrace topics in Mongolian and Chinese studies, Buryan diasporas, and particularly Buryan heroic epics and its historical construction, did her fieldwork extensively among the Buryat people in China, Mongolia, and Russia. Stefan is an independent researcher from Austria, lecturing at the University of Vienna. He has been doing sociocultural and anthropological as well as historical research focusing regionally on Siberia, Mongolia, and northern China, especially working among and about the Buryats, Tuvenians, and Russian Old Believers. Among groups of whom he has been carrying out series of long-term ethnographic field research. Thematically, he has been focusing on these groups' expressive culture, primarily sports and visual arts, as well as on their religious practices and migration movements. His main interest lies in the analysis of social changes and people's changing identities. He also investigates accounts of travelers from the West to the regions of his interest and their influence on science and the public in the West.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Anne and Arod, for organizing this dinner. And thank you for Martina and Monica did so much for this conference. So first let's see where are the Buryats? The Buryats are the Mongols of the three countries. You can see here the Buryats may be settled in the Russian Federation in the area to the west and south and east to the Lake Baikal, and also in the neighboring Mongolia and inner Mongolia of China. We can see more clearly in this picture. So they are both border and trans-border people, and in addition, an ethnic minority everywhere. So here, this picture illustrates the main groups or main outbooks, which consisted Buryats, Hirit Bolgot, Khor, Khongotir, and other small tribes. In geographical terms, the territory of Buryat settlement is located in the transition zone between the Trans-Asian Steppe belt and that of the taiga. Okay, next, who are the Buryats? The Buryats are a Mongolian ethnic group. Their total number is estimated at about 500,000. They formerly bore the name Buryat Mongols because they belong to the family of Mongolian peoples, of which they are the northernmost members, and are both linguistically and culturally close relatives of the Mongols in Mongolia and China. They become a distinct ethnic group after the 17th century when their territory was conquered and colonized by the Russians. However, close ties with the Mongols were kept throughout time and border was practically always crossed by them. Regardless of how strict this was forbidden and how heavy it was guarded, just more or less frequently and by more or less people, depending on the circumstances. Let's see the Buryat land. The Buryat's land is characterized by an alternation of mountains, steppe, and forest, and is also less arid. As a consequence, hunting has always played a more important role for their subsistence than for the other Mongols. And they have, especially in Lake Baikal, they also involved in fishing. So their traditional way of life is nomadic and semi-nomadic animal husbandry, like all Mongols. So this Talon Kushumak, or these 5 animals are really important for them. Despite the Russian influence, they also engage in fishing and agriculture. Here you can see they are growing potatoes, and they also eat bread like Russians. And this is their housing and today's city life. Western education, science, and technology has a strong influence on Buryats too. So this is Dr. Panzado, first Buryat academic leading Orientalist of his time, was fluent in more than 10 languages, wrote the first scientific book about shamanism. And Batmayev, he was official at the foreign ministry. He introduced the Tibetan medicine to the Western world. And Tagalog, first Asian ethnographer and school teacher, member of the Imperial Russian Geographic Society, he researched custom and folklore of the Buryats. And Agwan Darjiev, counselor and in-law of the 13th Dalai Lama, reformer of Buddhist Buddhism, founder of the Buddhist monastery in St. Petersburg. And Suren Zamstrano, famous scholar, collector of Buddhist folklore, member of the Buddhist National Committee, chair of the Scientific Committee of the Mongolian People's Republic. Now, notwithstanding these Western influences, the deeply rooted traditional religions among them, like shamanism and Buddhism, remained central for almost all Buryats. Christianity in its Russian Orthodox form and communist ersatz religion could not gain much of a foothold among them. I would say they developed their own identity and different from the Mongols. And this picture illustrates the migration of Buddhist people. When did the Buddhists come to Mongolia and China in greater numbers and staying permanently? It's only at the beginning and during the first third of the 20th century. So thank you all. Now I would like to invite Dr. Priest to present the next section. We can't hear you.
Okay, so now you can hear me. There's some technical issues here. PPT is not moving backwards and forwards. What's going on here?
Maybe I can share the PPT for you.
Maybe now it's working. Okay, our paper, I hope it's now working, this PPT thing. So our paper deals with the Erin Gurmanad and the Buryat 3 main games, wrestling, archery, and horse racing, which are, like among all Mongols, also the Buryats' traditional sports. And they are, of course, a result of their traditional way of life, which is nomadic animal herding, hunting, and at least in former times, frequent warfare. And secondly, these sports have been always a crucial part of their religious rituals, and both shamanic and Buddhist. And these sports are characterized by unique rules, specific customs, and specific clothing, equipment, and, as I said, their religious ritualistic purpose. During the Soviet time, 70 years of Soviet communist rule in Russia, those communist authorities, however, changed those sports heavily, and I summarized it like this. which led to a deliberate decrease of Buryat traditions in those sports, and not only the sports, and for the sports. International rules were adopted to make them closer and more similar to international Olympic-style sports. So that was what happened during the Soviet time, and that happened also in Mongolia and China, albeit to somewhat lesser degrees. In the post-Soviet period, we could observe, however, a re-traditionalization of those sports. In the festivals, during the Soviet time, there were many non-traditional sports included. They were now again kicked out, and the competitions in archery, wrestling, and horse racing were again held by traditional rules, obeyed to the traditional rules, and the sports competitions appeared again in religious contexts. So the revival of traditional rules, one can see here on this picture those waist belts on which these two wrestlers grab each other have been abandoned during the Soviet time, but were reintroduced in post-Soviet time. And as I said, the competitions are held again in the context of religious rituals, as this picture shows. In all three countries, Russia, China, and Mongolia, numerous competitions, that is Nadan games, that is festivals of these three sports, have been held locally and regionally at any time. Yet, since the fall of the Soviet Union and the subsequent opening of the borders between Russia, Mongolia, and China, several competitions and festivals have been held also on an international level. In what follows, we will briefly inform you about the trans-border, cross-border movements and transfers of people, animals, objects, knowledge, and news in conjunction with these sports activities. However, I want to say kind of a footnote here. Yes, the borders were reopened in the 1990s, but then step by step reclosed again, and since the pandemic they are closed at all. So what we, and that I think refers to the two other presentations before, what we are presenting here is actually pre-pandemic, the pre-pandemic situation. And this holds also true for our presentation. What will happen after that pandemic hopefully finally will end remains to be seen with cross-border and trans-border movements. So I continue. The most striking examples for those processes of trans-border, cross-border movements in conjunction with the traditional Buryat sports were the, since 1994, biannually held sports and folklore festivals Al-Targana, attended by Buryat sports people and artists from all three countries. They were hosted on a rotating basis by the regional governments of Buryat regions in Russia and in Mongolia. These are two pictures of the Al-Targana festival in Ulaanbaatar in 2010, and you can see there's a lot of people attending them, both as participants and spectators. Here during the opening ceremony, you can see the Shenichian Buryats marching in. Buryat sports people, especially wrestlers and Buryat artists, especially dancers, were however also crossing the border for attending smaller local events. Such were, for instance, the Bak Altargana, which means small Altargana, for the Buryats from the various regions in Mongolia. In 2019, organized in Keshik in northwestern Mongolia, and the Yokhor Nadan, a similar event hosted by the Bachiret, mainly Buryat community in northeastern Mongolia, which events Weigel and I attended and documented in 2019. So, cross-border or trans-border movements and transfers, I will present a few examples which stem from our fieldwork in Ulumbria 2018, Mongolia 2019, and again in Ulumbria 2021. So what crossed the border in connection with the sport, traditional Buryat sports? News. Of course, when people meet, they exchange news, but one Mongolian Buryat couple, for instance, even brought Buryat newspapers and journals from Russia to that Yokhor Nadan in Bachiret in Mongolia. Then what crosses the borders are animals. In our case, racehorses. So one Mongolian Buryat engaged in horse racing bought a racehorse in Buryat, here in Russia, for breeding purposes, and that was, as he told us, even done more frequently in a little bit earlier, a few years earlier. Then knowledge crosses the border in both directions. So two examples: wrestlers from Buryatia, that is from Russia, brought the current re-traditionalized wrestling style there in Russia among the Buryats to the Buryats in China. As in 2018, competitions in that particular style with the waist belts were held at several Obo Nadan games among the Shenichen Buryats in China. And also the Shenichen Buryats in China have invited a professional Buryat choreographer from Ulan-Ude in Russia to teach them the traditional Buryat dances. And that's the woman sitting next to me on this nice picture. So knowledge also crossed the border in both directions, as actually in the 1990s it went more in the other direction, that from the Shenichen Buryats, singers and dancers crossed the border and showed the Buryats there traditional songs and dances which had been forgotten there. In any case, there has been a significant movement of people. For instance, a dance group from Buryatia, from Russia, was taking part at the Bak Altargana in Teshik in Mongolia in 2019. As mentioned, the largest events where all this happened were the big biannually organized Altargana festivals. These events were attended by about 2,000 Buryat sports people, dancers, musicians, and officials from all three countries, and lasted for 3 up to 5 days with numerous competitions and show events. So I'm coming already close to a conclusion here. By organizing these events and meeting up at them, and by competing in these sports with each other, and by dancing and singing together, the Buryats of all three countries fostered a common Buryat self-identity, and at the same time the self-esteem of the members of the Buryat minorities in all three countries, as these events showcased their culture as distinct from the Russian, Mongolian, and Chinese. This was especially important for the Buryat minorities in Mongolia and China, as their culture and also language has become endangered due to no affirmative actions for safeguarding them by the Mongolian and Chinese governments, respectively. Thus, the declared goal of the organizers of these events was to reinforce a common Buryat identity as the mayor of Pachiret, a leader of the organizing committee of the Yokha Nadam Khuldas. They wanted, he said, especially raise the pride about being Buryat and the veneration for the Buryat culture among their youth, as they saw that fading among them. For reinforcing a common cross-border Buryat identity and culture, also particular measures were taken to unify the competition's procedures, their rules, as well as equipment and gear requirements. For instance, by inviting the Buryat wrestlers from Russia and holding wrestling competitions with their rules, as it was done at several Nadam games, accompanying Obo rituals among the Shenechin Buryats in China, which we can see on this picture, which I show you here again. However, also differences remained. For instance, is wrestling in the inner Mongolian style with wearing the leather tsodok jackets, still much more popular among the Shenechin Buryats, the Chinese Buryats, than wrestling in the Russian Buryat style. And in Mongolia, the Buryats have invented their own mixtures between the Mongolian and Russian Buryat style by having used either a simplified waist belt, as you can see on this picture, I think taken at the Altargana, which they considered enough for that the wrestlers can grab each other, where they usually would grab and carry a Mongolian tsodok jacket, or they even grab each other just on their shorts. And also different ways in archery between the Buryats from Russia and those of the other two countries in regard of how to pull the string and where to and how to rest the arrow, and the technique of the release of the arrow, and modifications on the bow remained. So this is a Buryat from Russia, using basically modern Western techniques, and here a female Buryat archer in China using the traditional Mongolian technique. And there's on the Mongolian and Chinese bows, you can never see such things like this, but the Russian Buryats do and modify their bows with carving arrow rests and putting some sights on the bows. Thus, due to the decades-long separation and the different cultural influences from the dominant ethnic and national cultures in the three countries, such differences remain up to the present day. Thus, as a conclusion, one can say that these processes of cultural revivals and attempts at unifying cultural features among the Buryats in the three countries are a prime example that such deliberate measures of fostering, re-traditionalizing and unifying cultural features are constantly negotiated between the involved and engaged actors. Once, at the Altargana festival held in 2010 in Ulaanbaatar, heated debates occurred, if one must not call them severe disputes, about the wrestling rules, as well as by which criteria the singers, musicians, and dancers who also competed in various contests should be judged. After all, it is humans who do this, and humans have different views and opinions and live under different circumstances and under different socio-economic conditions in these three different countries. Thus, despite having contributed to the recreation of a common trans-border period identity, we still observed at all these events plural or multiple identities as well as materialities. Russian period, Mongolian period, Chinese period, Chinese-Mongolian period, and common period. Whether the latter will keep slowly growing as it did until the pandemic and before the recent dramatic geopolitical as well as national political changes in at least two of the three countries, the war of Russia against the Ukraine and the alarming increase of totalitarianism and nationalism in Russia and China remains to be seen. I forgot about this. There is also differences in regard which targets are used in archery. And this is what we wanted to share. Thank you very much for your attention. How do we do this now with a questions and answer?
I have a sort of a conclusion and then we can open to the questions, if that's okay with you.
Yes.
So with this panel, we wish to explore how borderlands shape ethnicity and materiality in the everyday life of minority groups living in different parts of Northern Asia, mainly Mongolia, Russia, and Northeast China. We aimed at understanding how daily or sporadic coexistence between trans-border people, same ethnic groups scattered in different countries such as the Buryats, the Ruzha, the Nanai, the Evenki, the Mongols, shapes a changing self-perception of ethnic identity and can produce plural materiality. So Aurore Dumont has questioned the conceptions and perceptions of ethnicity in context of interaction among groups that embrace a common kinship at the same time as belonging to different countries, China, Mongolia, and Russia. And the notions of otherness and likeness are used by her as conceptual frameworks to understand the local narratives, the minority group self-representations and perceptions of their kin others. I decided to analyze how cultural policies influence the creation of material culture to the extent that they may reshape what is produced on either side of the border. The impact of indigenous agency on the implementation of these policies is also questioned to show how the political framework is also a place for minority groups to act on their self-representations. Stefan Christ and Weidel Kwasai have approached the Buryat Manly Games with regards to their mobility across the borders between China, Russia, and Mongolia. By analyzing these interactions during large-scale and small-scale events, they are interrogating the strengthening of the Buryat self-identity, which goes alongside the representation of the Buryat alterity, or otherness, but also they have interrogated the tools through which this self-identity is built. And these three presentations focus on very different case studies, and yet they have in common to show that ethnicities and identities are not simply applied on minority groups. They are objects of compromise, negotiations, and agency. And each case shows that the results are not always what could be expected. Sometimes they elude geopolitical framework. And I think Stefan's mentions of the pandemic and the geopolitical situation also show that the situations on borders is also a little precarious. And so I think these presentations show that the border is not a simple political frontier allowing or preventing contacts, but it is also an integral part of identity perceptions and self-perceptions. So maybe we can have questions now?
I'm still trying to come up with a question, but I just want to say that I really love these presentations. And I'm just kind of overwhelmed actually now just thinking about the diversity of different experiences you're talking about. You know, I recently read Ed Fulford's article about, you know, the Khoja and Nanai and how, and his argument was that you know, they were kind of really incorporated right into the Russian and Chinese sides, and that when the border reopened, it wasn't really very substantive in terms of their reunification and so forth. And you mentioned that also in your talk about different languages and how they're really kind of separated culturally. But then, of course, as Aurora was talking about in the case of the Uvenki, at least, right, that they had this kind of sense of likeness in spite of the borders. I guess that's partly, as you were saying, because of language and the cultural values and views remain similar. And then Stefan and Paigal kind of talking about how you know, this attempt to actually try to reunify, right, and through retraditionalization across the borders, and how that was kind of being renegotiated. So it's really, I mean, I'm just kind of really overwhelmed right now by just the richness, right, and the diversity of these different ways of thinking about the borders and how they impact, and how they're appropriated, right, in different ways by the groups. And I guess one of the things I guess really sort of makes me wonder is, you know, in so many of the studies and talks, we do think about borders as these kind of imposed difference-making, you know, instruments of state control, and certainly Frank Billet has talked about that, right? That there's this, you know, we're talking about these spaces that kind of challenge or subvert, right, those borders in some way. But you know, what I think is really interesting to me from your talks is in a way, although you're saying that borders are important, it seems almost like they're not important in some ways, in the sense that these groups are, well, it's not that they're not important, but you're really showing how these groups are able to navigate these differences in remarkably creative ways. And so I guess maybe my overarching question would be, you know, what would be your overall evaluation based on the research of, you know, how you are, or how you're reevaluating or challenging kind of ideas about borders through these rich studies?
Who wants to take that question?
But do you have an answer, Stefan?
Not really. I think it is very individually even different. When every person would have probably every Gurian, every Evenk, every Hösche person will probably has a different answer to that question, and it is changing all the time. As I said, you know, the borders were reopened really really reopened in the 1990s. But then already at the end of the 1990s, a few years later, the first border crossing posts were closed again, at least between Mongolia and Russia. And so the reclosure of the border started actually long before the pandemic. And now we have the pandemic, and what will happen after the pandemic, we don't know. And then how much the border influences what people do or want to do, or how much it influences their personal lives, it is individually different. And so I think one cannot give a one answer to that question. But maybe you are right that for the people we are investigating here, these borders play not such a big role as one would expect on first sight. But maybe. I'm not sure, but this could be like this.
May I say something? Martin, thank you for your comments and questions. I wanted to add something about, because we are talking about the border as an instrument of control for something which is imposed on population. The border is open, the border is closed, and so on throughout time. But actually, so I was thinking about this when you asked the question. Actually, it seems to me that most of people actually, local people, do not use the term border. They talk about the other side. They talk about the country, like Russia, Mongolia. So this is something, maybe we, as anthropologists, historians, and so much, maybe we talk too much about the border. I don't know, but for local people, they really rarely use the term border. They have a different, I believe, appreciation of what the border means for them. So this is what I wanted to add.
I have something to add too. Thank you for your comment and third question. I think from the perspective of nomadic people, in the history, they were nomadic people, okay, especially the Buryats, Mongols, Owangs. How to say, the inner Asia was where they were just chasing after their cows and sheep, and at that time they don't have the concept of border, and they were just freely moving around these places. So I think in the land side of nomadic people, their understanding of border maybe is different. And that is why they could, in different creative ways to navigate the border. Yeah, thank you. Yes, but this needs to be explored further.
Yeah, maybe I can add something to what you said, Aurore, about the fact that maybe we instrumentalize border a little too much as anthropologists. And I think minority groups can be characterized by their adaptability to dominating political frameworks that sort of shape the way they place themselves within relationships, within political ideas and everything. And I think, again, border is just one among many other tools that minority groups can appropriate or not to voice. Well, here it's the question of ethnic identity, but it could be other things. I think Aurore talked about economy as well, how the Mongols from inner China became vectors between Mongolia and China for economic purposes. And the example of the Nanai and the Khuzhou was quite different, I think, to the other two examples, as the border is much more closed and the place in the other examples tool to express a Khuzhou identity and a Nanai on the other side, and to differentiate each other from their kin other in the other country. I don't know if that last point made sense, but that makes sense.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah. No, please, Martin.
Oh no, I was just saying thank you for
Is there any question from the audience in Seoul? Because we cannot see the room. I mean, we can see the screen in the room, but not the people in the room. So, are there any people in the room actually?
Yeah,
So may I ask one or two questions for Bargal and Stefan?
yes, please.
Can you tell us a little bit more about how the international Boyat Festival are organized? By whom is paying, where is the money come from, and so on? I'm very interested in this very technical aspect. Are the different governments involved in the organization of such an event? So that was my first question. And another one is that, so the Boyats have many clans, right? So is there a kind of, how to say, a kind of specific connection between people who belong to the same clans? I mean, is there a kind of clan identity between Boyat people living in different countries? That was my question. Second question.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good questions. I think I take the first question and Weigel will take the second question. That would be my suggestion. Regarding the who organizes the Altargana festivals organized, one has now to use the past tense because we don't know whether it will be done again. Yes, but they want to do actually this year in Russia in Chita. It should happen. They want to do it in August this year, but how that will work remains to be seen, as the borders are basically closed and the whole political and economic situation in Russia. We will see how that. Back to your question, who organizes those Altargana festivals and where does the money come from? It's mainly governmental taxpayers' money in Russia. So it's organized by the local governments, the government of Ulan-Ude or the government of Irkutsk or the government of the Ust-Orda Buryat region or something. So it's basically a governmental organization, and thus the finances also mainly come from there, plus sponsoring. So there is quite some rich Buryat businessmen who sponsor these events and take it as an opportunity for advertising their things or maybe for fostering their ambitions of running for elections or something. They are political party, of course. In former times, like long ago, 20 years ago or so, there was sometimes these sports events were fostered by political parties, by various different parties in Russia, but although for now almost 20 years it's just the one party of President Putin, Единая Россия, and that appears actually also quite frequently as a sponsor of the sports events, including Altargana festivals. So it is governmental money, and there is big businessmen who use these Altargana festivals as a stage for their purposes. Did I answer your first question?
Yeah, thank you.
Weigel, can you say something about the clans and the clan identity among the Buryats?
Sorry, Aurora, could you repeat the question?
So my question is, so you have the Buryat belong to clans, right? So my question is there any connection between a given clan, but whose members are from different countries? You understand my question? Or maybe I should...
I understand now. Yeah, actually, it's how to say, it's the origin of the oboks. Actually, they said in Mongolian they said obok in Buryat. So at the 13th century, when Genghis Khan ruled the oboks of the steppe, they come under the Genghis Khan, yes. And then in the 17th century, when Russian conquered the territory of where Buryat people live, they became Buryat actually, and then in that, which includes many regions. Some of them are Mongols from Mongolia, like I think the Hongotr is from Mongolia, yes, and the Hor people is also has the Mongol origin, but the Ikrit and Bolgot was the indigenous people who lives around the Lake Baikal. And yes, also the Tawanang and Ashpokat, I think they also from the south.
Yeah, okay, thank you. But I mean also today, you know, when the Buryats from different countries, when they meet during, you know, international festivals, in Agana, is there a connection between clans? I mean today, you know?
Actually, now the mainly people who lives in Mongolia, they belong to Hor Buryat.
Okay.
And there are 11 clans of Hor Buryat, and the Mongolia's Buryat, they belong to 8 clans of Ag Buryat.
Okay.
Actually, Ag Buryat is like the 8 clans of the 11 Hor Buryats. How to say? They belong to them.
Okay. Okay.
And also the same in Xinjiang Buryat in China, they are mainly Hor Buryats, but really few other oboks. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
I guess I have another question maybe that came to mind for the government. One question I have is whether these groups have, so you talked a lot about how they see themselves trying to negotiate their distinctiveness from the majority group of the countries they live in. But do they also see themselves in relation to other ethnic groups in the regions? And also, how do they negotiate their national identities as well? So if they see themselves this kind of ethnicization or retraditionalization and a kind of a revival, appropriation of their own identities, how do they sort of negotiate that with the sort of nationalism or with the national frameworks and narratives as well?
Well, if I may spontaneously react to that question, multiple identities. That's what people have there. They are Russian and Buryat at the same time, and they are Chinese and Buryat, Mongolian at the same time, or Mongolian and Buryat. They are both. Most of them will say, well, I am a Chinese citizen, but an ethnic Mongolian or something, or just multiple identities. There are quite good examples for that. And I can say one thing regarding, if I understood your question correctly, the relationship to other ethnic minorities in these countries. Well, that can be complicated, including conflicts. So there is the one conflict I am actually, and Michael, we are somehow investigating this, mainly it's me. There is a conflict between the the Buryats and the Solon events going on in Urumbuya about land. So quite a classical land conflict. So that is also different, but there is all sometimes very good relationships, but sometimes not. The opposite. Both is happening. Okay.
I
finished.
I agree with the idea of multiple identities, and I think it depends on the context in which they have to voice a certain identity or not. For instance, I have mostly worked in Russia. For instance, Nanai people could ask each other if another person was Nanai, for instance, by asking the last name of the clan name, actually, and that would be a criteria for saying if that person was Nanai or not. But in other instances, when it was maybe more an official context, then this question of clan belonging would not come into question. But the identity as a Nanai would not be questioned for this. So I think it all depends on the context when one or the other or another identity would be the object of the context. So I think the idea of multiple identities is actually quite relevant. And concerning the other minorities, in the Khabarovsky Krai in Russia, the minority groups, there are 10 minority groups, but the separations between the groups is not quite clear-cut. For instance, the Ulch are mostly Nanai people, and sometimes they believe that they say that they are Nanai, and the Nanai say that the Ulch are part of their group as well. So the official political classification is not always very relevant in this region. And what I found was that a way to differentiate each group from the other was through material culture and through embroideries. And so there are many discourses on, the Negidals use more flowers, the Evenki use more geometrical shapes, the Nanai use more swirls, for instance. And so material culture became a sort of visual element to differentiate groups.
So thank you. I think our session is going to finish quite soon. Maybe I wanted to add something to Martin's question about how people see themselves to all our groups. So as Stefan and Baidal said, immediately this is quite complicated because you have so many different groups. And also it has something to do with the way ethnic minorities are categorized by the Chinese state. Because if you take the Evenki case in China, you have like 3 subgroups. So in my presentation I was talking about the Rabi herders, who actually have almost nothing to do with another subgroup of Solon, who lives in the grasslands. So they are supposed to, so all of them call themselves Evenki, but they have the consciousness of being very different. And this difference is going through language, material culture, but also the way people use the territory. So that was another answer to the question. But this is a very interesting topic, and we can talk about this for hours. So.
Thank you so much for wonderful presentations and comments.
Yes, if I could add some quickly, like where Urad conducted his fieldwork, where I came from that place, I'm a native anthropologist in Ulumber, but not in Mongolia and Russia. So, how to say, from my impression as I grew up there, actually those ethnic minorities compete and collaborate with each other. Somehow more competitions are going on over there, but they don't compete with Chinese, Han Chinese somehow, or less competition than between the minorities. I think that is interesting too. Yeah, thank you.
I think this is interesting. This is also very important because when we are talking about China and its ethnic minorities, we are always trying to put the Han Chinese versus ethnic minorities. But this is not always like this. This is more complicated, and you are right. If we take the case of Louis, we have these ethnic minorities who are collaborating, but also competing with each other, and the Han Chinese have nothing to do with this. So this is, yeah, very, very interesting.
So I just have maybe a quick, I know we don't have any time left, but just a quick thing, because I know I've heard, I think Bulag, or in Bulag has talked about sort of the land conflicts between, you know, the Han Chinese expansion into, for instance, Inner Mongolia and the Mongols. So are you saying that sort of among the Buryat there's really isn't that sense of the Han Chinese kind of encroaching on their lands or their territory?
I think this is a question for Baigan and Stefan, no? For the Buryat.
Yes, I think you were talking about Beitahuang yesterday, yes?
Yes.
Yeah, actually, okay, then I think actually Hulunbuir is less influenced by the Beitahuang or the Chinese approaching of the Mongolian land. But yeah, there's some similar issues going on, but I think, yeah, it has to be more, how to say, I have to be more careful. I have to make some studies first and then talk about it. It's complicated, yeah. Stefan, can you add something?
I'm not sure whether I understood the question correctly, but there is some pressure from Han Chinese grabbing land, also in Hulunbuir, but not that much. It's not. There is Han Chinese who are doing arable agriculture there and taking away land from the others, but not so much. Most of the land is still in the hands of the ethnic minorities. This is what I have seen.
Yeah,
Correct me by the
yeah, sorry.
Okay, I'm done.
Oh, you are done. So yeah, I was thinking about the Hokchin, who actually possess more and more lands in Hulunbuir, and they are accused of being kind of because they are not native from Hulunbuir and they lose land. So this is again a competition between those people who are settled for many years and those Hokchin who are coming, and because they are very numerous. But this is a complicated issue.
Thank you so much.
So I think, I don't know, Anne, if you have something to add, but I think our session is over. It's, I wanted to say it's 9 o'clock, no, it's 9 o'clock in France, but in Seoul it's 4 p.m., more than 4 p.m., so should we stop here or?
Probably we can wrap it up.
Okay.
Thank you so much for all. I really enjoyed the keynote. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you very much, Martin, for your comments, questions, and your participation in our panel. It was really fruitful for us, I think.
Yes.
Thank you so much for this wonderful panel. I really appreciate it. Hopefully we can stay in touch in some way or another.
Yeah.
Thank
you.
Thank
Bye.
you very much.
Thank you,
Thanks to
bye-bye.
everyone. Bye-bye.